I don't speak English. Today, we're in the mood of I don't speak English, a great flaw in my education. And today, since there wasn't, chest, off brick, petrified, I don't know others, I don't know that many synonyms for stone in English, I don't speak English. Rock hard test, very good. Today, the topic is the fucked up messes of America. That being said, let's move on to the first topic, which is the United States giving up its bourgeois democratic veneer. We know that the United States is a phony, fake democracy, right? We know that it's a country with two parties that defend two wings of the bourgeoisie, and that's it. It's an alternation between two parties whose difference is marginal, and, if we're going to be very strict with more formal definitions, Brazil is more democratic than the United States, folks, when it comes to bourgeois democracy. Brazil has a multi-party democracy. What I mean is, on the formal bourgeois democracy checklist, Brazil meets more criteria. The United States meets far fewer. In the United States, the person who receives the most votes doesn't always win. So, you see how low the bar is there in the United States. And for you to see how strongly the democracy propaganda reaches people to the point that they believe the United States is the beacon of freedom in the world. That being said, the character of American democracy is beginning to show, which is actually the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And that's what we are going to talk about now, about something that had a lot of repercussion, but in very different ways, depending on the source. And the analysis, my goodness, analysis of the United States from bourgeois newspapers, from the Brazilian mainstream media, is terrible, you know? Wow. Trump asks homeless people to move far from Washington. So did you get to see this these days? The American president plans to hold a press conference this Monday to present his plan to make the city safer and more beautiful than ever. Trump is starting to establish a kind of state of exception in Washington, implementing all the policies he wants by force, with brute force. And so we're going to analyze this here in a little more detail, so you don't get caught in disinformation, with the Brazilian bourgeois media trying to cover up for this kind of thing. So let's go. Trump's statement is as follows. Homeless people must leave immediately. We will give them shelter further away from the capital. He wrote on his platform Truth Social. Folks, just an aside here. Isn't it a disgrace that to see what the President of the United States says, a person has to keep going on his fucking shitty social network? You have to keep going on this trash social network that nobody uses to see what the President says. Because he was banned from fucking everything, you know? So my condolences to the journalists who have to suffer by going on this. Fucking Third Reich social network here. And, well, folks, this is something I haven't talked about here on the channel for a while. In the beginning of the channel, I talked about it a lot because it was a topic that was popping up. But now it's worth revisiting, which is the theme of hygienism. Jeffrey Epstein's buddy over there is practicing the good old hygienist policy. And in case you don't know, hygienism is a form of urban space organization based on the idea of cleanliness as a priority, of pushing away what is considered dirty and ugly, including human beings. So hygienism advocates that people who are homeless don't have problems, they are the problem, and that they should be kept out of sight regardless of the causes and regardless of the consequences, okay? So for the hygienist, the problem isn't social condition. The problem is the city's appearance. It's what these people cause to the other people in the city. Is the damage that a homeless person or the risk or threat that a homeless person causes to those who are not homeless, completely disregarding that that person is there for a reason. And that reason is always social. And so, laws that corroborate this type of hygienist policy are usually laws that prohibit loitering. They are hostile architecture constructions to prevent people from sleeping on the street or in public places. This is all a type of policy to avoid saying, loud and clear, get out of here, you are unwanted. But Trump doesn't have these scruples, right? Trump, he doesn't really have that filter. He basically says, get out of here, you are not wanted. It's a big fuck you to give the impression of cleanliness. And here in Sao Paulo, we see this every day too. And this can range from what I mentioned about hostile architecture to folks, beatings, theft of the belongings of people on the street, expulsion with water jets, even massacres. This can happen. A massacre is an extreme form of hygienism. It's a demonization of homeless people. Without ever asking why the city generates so many homeless people. And this is practically a rule for right-wing governments, okay? And right-wing governments do this not only because they don't want to solve these people's situation, but because they can't offer anything to these people. Right-wing governments advocate for dismantling the public machine. They advocate for downsizing state institutions. They can't offer a solution for these people because that contradicts their own economic policy. So yes, They don't want to, but they also can't. And since they can't offer a solution, they offer a palliative. They offer something that gives the illusion of a solution. There was also the case of the human dog catcher van in Balneario Camboriú. A human dog catcher van, folks, just like the one for dogs, takes them far away and then brings them back when the tourist season is over. Another type of hygienism, okay? If you want a book about the origins of hygienism in Brazil, there is a very good history book called Cidade Febril, Feverish City, by Sidney Chalub, where he talks about the destruction of the tenements in Rio de Janeiro and the birth of the favelas in Rio de Janeiro. Alright, there's the book tip. Well, since the far right and the right can't offer a solution and don't want to offer a solution, they use the homeless population as a scapegoat for other policies as well. And Trump is a fascist, and increasingly a fascist in the classic sense. He's getting closer and closer to the fascism of the 20s and 30s. And one of the things he has been doing is one of the traditional measures of fascism, which is the militarization of society. We saw this a lot in Italy and Germany in the 20s and 30s, respectively, right? And why is that? Since fascists defend the interests of the bourgeoisie, and usually these interests are defended in times of crisis, these fascists have no interest in solving the population's social issues, social problems, the origin of social inequality. So, for them, the solution is brute force. For fascists, the problem is always discipline and militarization. A social program for a fascist is, quote, an incentive for vagrancy. And Trump is literally doing that. Take a look here. Trump's budget proposal. It foresees cuts, increased military spending, and spending on deportations. Trump is literally doing what we just described. They are cutting programs that subsidize health, housing, and food for poor families and increasing military spending. It couldn't be more explicit than that. And these are social programs that helped the United States a lot to recover during the pandemic period. If we are to be very strict within the parameters of American bourgeois democracy, Biden did not hand over the economic situation of the United States in a critical state to Trump. He did not leave a difficult economic situation for Trump within the parameters of the capitalist bourgeois democracy of the United States, which becomes very clear here. US GDP rises 2.4% in the fourth quarter of 2024. And in the previous year, we also had, let's say, positive results for these parameters. United States creates 216,000 jobs in December, and unemployment rate stays at 3.7%, according to the payroll. 3.7% is 3.7% more than a socialist allows. For us, unemployment should be zero. There should be full employment. But anyway, for bourgeois democracy, this is almost full employment or considered full employment anyway. And before anyone says I'm making excuses for Biden, that's not the point. Okay, folks? These jobs are shitty jobs. They are very low-paying jobs. They are degrading jobs. That's not the point. We saw, for example, in the video about generational conflict, that the United States has not adjusted wages in relation to productivity since the 80s practically. And even with these jobs, this employability under the Biden administration, thousands and thousands of people continue to live on the street. Simple as that. The point is, it was these public subsidies that Trump is cutting now that made the relative recovery of the United States from the pandemic possible. They helped the money circulate better. They injected a huge package into society without any kind of economic orthodoxy to recover the economy from the shock of the pandemic. Look, we didn't talk that much about this at the time, did we? Understand what the Biden plan to reactivate the US economy is about. It was 1.9 trillion in incentives. All this with a public apparatus, in addition to the hyped Green New Deal of 2022 that we have already mentioned here a few times, which was a program to accelerate the energy transition. That is, what they consider energy transition within these parameters. And never be fooled, okay? The Biden administration was the same one that allowed oil exploration in Alaska, which is something tragic. Not to mention the genocide in Palestine. Don't come at me with this, Ian. You're making excuses for the Democrats thing, okay? Don't come with that stuff. What I'm doing here is an analysis and trying to show you what state the United States was in when Trump started dismantling these programs here. So why is Trump cutting so much from these programs with huge budgets? First of all, folks, Trump is not interested in keeping the United States economy stable. He's not interested in that. What Trump is doing is accelerating a political transition. Transitioning the way the United States positions itself on the contemporary geopolitical stage. That's what's happening. And Trump himself is saying this. This is not a conspiracy theory. He is there to be the figurehead who will accelerate the transition of the United States to a new and very critical period. We always say here that there is nothing more dangerous than an empire in decline, right? Trump talks about a transition period and downplays the risk of a US recession. Again, it's not a conspiracy. He's saying here exactly what we are saying too. What does the American bourgeoisie want now? to make labor relations precarious, repress unions, and have an openly imperial posture for the United States. You saw this with the change of the goose name, with the thing about let's annex Mexico and Canada, let's annex Greenland. These are signs, sort of cartoonish signs, of the demand of this bourgeoisie, do you understand? And the economic slowdown may be necessary to accelerate this transition. And why is that? Because one thing that is scaring the bourgeoisie that finances Trump is the high rate of unionization in the United States. This is very similar to classic fascism too, okay? Because the United States is experiencing a peak of unionism and strikes in 50 years. So folks, Trump, as we said in our election analysis live stream when he won, represents a bourgeoisie that is more linked to the national production process, and because of the crisis, especially the pandemic, unionism is making itself very visible in the United States these days. This in a country that already has a history of gigantic union repression, okay? What has been bothering the bourgeoisie is that in this moment of political transition crisis, unions are regaining bargaining power. That's what Trump is there to repress. He's there to be the figurehead again for the bourgeoisie that will prevent unions from gaining strength. That's on the domestic front. On the external front, what's scary is something you all already know. China. China is scaring the United States a lot on the external front. And as we said in our analysis last year, Trump was put there to de-escalate conflicts involving Russia and escalate conflicts involving China, because he represents a bourgeoisie that believes it's not possible to face Russia and China at the same time, unlike the Democrats who think it's necessary to face both at the same time. In China's case, between the 80s and 2000, US industries transferred their plants to China. China turned this into an immense process of technology transfer. American capitalists focused on short-term profit. Both got what they wanted. But now China, because it has a long-term plan, is taking advantage. The US bourgeoisie profited a lot by paying low wages in China. And China developed, over the course of 30 to 40 years, a high-tech industry. Now, the Chinese industry is coming on strong against the same American bourgeoisie and biting them in the ass. That's what's happening. And so, that's why you've seen the same bourgeoisie that supports Trump pushing for market closure to Chinese products and not just Chinese ones, to prevent China from using other countries as a platform as well. China, China, exactly. As they say in the chat, China, China, all the time. The Europeans are also creating protectionist measures at this point, okay? Because they also made the same move of transferring their industrial plants to China. But in the United States, there is a difference compared to Europe, which is the dispute for global hegemony, right? China is threatening the United States' place as the planet's economic power. Made in USA, in disuse, is being replaced by made in China. So the US bourgeoisie that supports Trump is pushing for a stance of putting their dick on the table, of coming in and fuck and really blackmailing. That's why we saw 50% here in Brazil. It was in the style of took off my panties, leaving me just in my bra and panties, right? We didn't talk about this, but the United States taxed Brazil, except on everything that matters. They taxed, but they made exceptions for everything that would harm them. Why? Because Trump is doing this as a bluff. He first imposes taxes to negotiate later. That's what the right doesn't understand either. So this bourgeoisie wants the government to close the commercial borders to China, regardless of whether it harms the population's purchasing power. That doesn't matter. And to put the countries that are increasing relations with the Chinese in their place. For example, tightening the circle against the BRICS, which is what motivated Trump's taxation. It wasn't Bolsonaro. If you want to see an analysis on this, there's a video here on the channel, by the way. So, defense of the bourgeoisie's privileges internally and externally. And this depends on a closing of the regime. So this veneer of democratic freedom in the United States is fading away. It's showing that it's just that. A veneer. And it has always been just a veneer, okay folks? The United States has always been a country of a lot of censorship and a lot of oppression. Malcolm X, Luther King, Fred Hampton never had the opportunity to have freedom of opinion, okay? They were all assassinated. The FBI and the CIA spy on millions of citizens daily. And this, including with the consent of the Patriot Act under Bush Jr. in 2001, there are a lot of public censorship policies for the media. We have, for example, heavy censorship in cinema, which for how many years? For 30 years was prevented from showing double beds, shirtless men, interracial marriage. This is all public policy, okay? McCarthyism persecuted a lot of people and put everyone on a blacklist for suspected connections to communism. People who could never find a job again in their lives. Countless examples of censorship and persecution in the United States, okay? The veneer of freedom of the First Amendment, Second Amendment, the Third Amendment is a veneer. But now even the veneer doesn't matter anymore. Now this economic and political transition of Trump's is making everything as explicit as possible. And this will generate protests, folks, affecting prices, affecting jobs, affecting unionism, affecting inflation. All of this will generate protests and social movements. It will. And that's when fascism comes as the appropriate tool for this kind of moment. To sustain this type of policy, which is the demand of the bourgeoisie, of a regime closure, of protectionism that will harm the population, of combating unionism. All these will generate this revolt that needs repression, physical repression. And not only that, Trump is also moving towards repressing the wing of the bourgeoisie that is diverging from this process, which is the wing of the bourgeoisie represented by the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party does not represent the people, it does not represent the workers, it represents the bourgeoisie that disagrees with this public policy. And how has he been doing this? By strengthening the federal executive power centralized in him. And so we return to the situation of the homeless in Washington. Trump asks homeless people to move far from Washington. Let's tie everything together with this case. At the same time, Trump attacks the homeless, tells them to go far away, and cuts spending on social programs that help, for example, people to pay rent. What will be the result of these, folks? More people having to live on the street, living in their own car, which is something that happens a lot in the United States. Have you ever noticed that on TikTok or Reels, Americans are always inside their own cars, doing shit or talking shit? There are people who live in their cars, there are Brazilians who go to the United States to live in their cars. Folks, that's it, okay? That's what happens there. The car thing in the United States is a nightmare. The United States basically is a gigantic parking lot. It's kind of like that. We can define the United States as a gigantic parking lot. And so this new way of dealing with social problems is through violence, okay? The objective of this measure is to cement this new way. It's treating a social problem as a police matter, as we heard about here in Brazil during the Old Republic, right? Cut social programs, and whoever can't keep their job, their home, is repressed, gets kicked out, gets beaten by the police, and fuck it. Because whoever can't work and keep their own house, whoever can't keep a job, is a loser. Losers have no place in the United States. It's like a contemporary social Darwinism. Not that Trump is smart enough to even understand what that word means. And look at the consequences of Trump's statement. In case you think this won't happen there because our institutions there are very strong. Trump takes control of the police and sends troops to clean up Washington. That's why we started by saying that Trump is turning Washington into a kind of state of exception. Look how the body of sexual predator Jeffrey Epstein justified this, quote, Trump said that Washington will be liberated today from crime, filth, and scam, his words. Our capital has been taken down by violent gangs, criminals, maniacs, savages, and homeless people. And we're not going to let that happen anymore. We will not accept it, he told the press. Folks, besides talking about the violent statistics in Washington, let's take this list here. Violent gangs, criminals, maniacs, savages, and homeless people. Homeless people. For Trump, homeless people are the same as savage maniacs, violent gangs. And they will be treated as such. And fuck it, if people have a reason to be on the street. If they fell into addiction, if they lost their job, if they can't pay rent, if they were abandoned by their family, if they had problems with violence, if they are people with psychiatric problems who were abandoned by their family and the public authorities, it doesn't matter, fuck it. The goal of public policy should be to rescue these people. But these people in Brazil and the United States fall into a vicious cycle of accumulating disadvantage. You lose your job, then you end up on the street, then you're on the street, then you get addicted, then you're addicted, then you go to jail, then you're arrested, and it starts to become something you can't get out of anymore. You get stuck in a circle that once you enter, it's very difficult to get out of. In Brazil then, when you join a criminal faction, then you never get out again. That's the problem, you never get out again because the faction prevents it, in fact. And so everyone wins with these efficient policies of rescuing people who have nowhere to live. Everyone wins. But that's not the goal. Both because he has no interest and because he cannot offer it. Offering this contradicts the very demand of the bourgeoisie, which is demanding a regime closure, greater pressure on workers. And look how, folks, these homeless people are serving as scapegoats to toughen a state of exception in Washington. He is using homeless people to justify the repressive measure. That will affect everyone who lives in Washington, not just homeless people. The ideological motivation is very explicit, especially when we see that the crime rate in Washington has been falling. Quote here. Contrary to what the Americans stated, crime in the area has fallen. The city's police department states that violent crimes decreased by 26% in Washington in the first 7 months of 2025 compared to last year, while overall crimes decreased by about 7%. In other words, Trump contradicts the statistics, but it doesn't matter, because he also communicates with his base through closed social networks, where this kind of information doesn't reach. And if it does, he says it's the extremist press. He says it's fake news. He says the only ones who tell the truth are Fox News and Truth Social. And the Democratic mayor reacted to this. The Democratic mayor is named Muriel Bowser. Trump's order to take over Washington's security is alarming and unprecedented, says mayor, who claims not to be surprised. It's Trump's second intervention in the competencies of regions governed by Democrats. The first was in Los Angeles. Trump sent the National Guard to suppress protests. And that created a lot of tension with the Democratic governor, who is Gavin, I think that's his name, Gavin Newsom. So, Gavin Newsom is one of the guys who is becoming a spokesperson for Trump's authoritarian escalation, so to speak. And it's funny, because they usually use this to demonstrate how weak the Democrats are. How the Democrats are woke and effeminate, anyway. You know how the discourse is in the United States, right folks? The surface is usually like that. But, again, both represent the interests of the bourgeoisie, just of bourgeoisies that sometimes conflict with each other. And so Trump also takes the opportunity to make it difficult for the blue states that are the Democrats, to govern. It's curious that in the United States, the color red is associated with the far right. I said Gavin, it's Gavin. And why did we say here that we wanted to bring this topic to move away a bit from the analysis of the Brazilian bourgeois media? Because there are people who are saying that this situation, that this attack on homeless people is a partisan conflict, folks, and that's a very shallow reading, okay? It's a very reductionist reading. The issue of homeless people is a synthesis of what the Trump administration represents. There is a wing of the bourgeoisie interested in maintaining a veneer of function of democracy and repressing workers in an institutionalized way. Those are the Democrats, okay? Is it repression of the workers? It is. But with a veneer of democracy, it is. Trump is from the America First wing. He's from the run over them with the tractor and fuck it wing. He's from the wing of violence and violence justified as virility. The coming years hold this very same perspective. That's why we wanted to bring this here. Because what is happening in Washington could escalate into a state of exception in other places. And a state of exception that is justified by Trump as being rational and supported by his base. It won't be without the consent of the population, at least the population that supports him. Is there a risk of World War III? Yes. Will it happen? I don't know, but there is a risk. Nothing is more dangerous than a decadent empire. And what we are seeing internally is almost a risk of civil war. Because if there is a popular reaction, Trump is demonstrating that his solution will be violence. So in other words, what is happening in Washington is basically what Trump wants for the United States, and in reality, it's what Trump wants for the whole world. To treat with violence. To treat with brute force. And it's curious to see the knot this ties in the minds of those who in the United States call themselves liberals. A liberal in the United States is a supporter of the Democratic Party. They are divided between conservatives and liberals. The conservatives are the supporters of the Republican Party, the red one, and the Democrats. The liberals are the supporters of the Democratic Party, the blue ones. And these ties are knocking their heads. Because when Trump does something like this, the response from the liberals, the Democrats is, but the institutions don't allow this. But how can he be doing this? He can't. Yet they don't realize that this is a veneer, that the institutions in fact are a facade for the interests of the bourgeoisie, that real power comes from material power. So it's interesting to see the way Democrats try to rationalize what is happening. Politics in the United States is not strange. Politics in the United States is the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie taken to its ultimate consequences. 3 more centimeters from that shot, and we wouldn't be talking about this guy. It's fucked up, right? A turn of a stab, and we wouldn't be talking about Bolsonaro either. Destiny is incredible. Crime pays off a fucking lot, by the way. It's like Foro de Teresina talking about Bolsonaro. It's funny, right? This type of analysis, let's say, that looks at the Constitution and says, how did Bolsonaro do this? He can't. Yes, he can't. So what? He can't. History doesn't hold them accountable. It's a lie. History, folks, we are seeing a return of Nazism. History doesn't hold neo-Nazis accountable. The comrade here said, this thing with the United States and the homeless is so ugly that, in Vermont, it's a crime to shelter or facilitate homeless people with a penalty of up to 6 months in prison and a fine of $1,000. And then the comrade said, Sao Paulo is this close to being the same. It wasn't for lack of trying, okay? Remember Bia Doria, saying that it's very easy to live on the street because you don't have to do anything. Every time I see a sculpture by Bia Doria on the street, I get filled with hatred. Where's the rooster to set fire to these two? Bia Doria is Doria's wife, who is a visual artist and also has aporophobia. So that's it. We had our first topic here about the fucked up messes of America. taking advantage of this break in the middle of the live stream to remind you that I have an apoia.c Historia Publica, that we have now launched Soberana TV. Follow Soberana TV on YouTube. There will be videos every Monday. We are continuing. Web Comunistas on ICL, a video every Wednesday. There will be 12 videos in total. And here on the channel, we will continue on Tuesdays and Thursdays talking about news. We'll be back soon with the essays on the Historia Publica channel. Once Laura and I finish filming Web Comunistas, finally. Alright?